Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Jen. I, like many folks on the team, work with the Global Climate and Health Alliance. I'm joined today on this webinar by Jess Beagley, who's going to walk us through the day, as well as by Milena Sergeeva, all of whom work with me at the Global Climate and Health Alliance. And with that, Jess, can I turn it over to you to introduce our first speaker?
Sure thing. So Dr. Petra Minero is a professor of international law at the University of Durham, and she's been working across multiple aspects of climate legislation, but she's going to present on a specific aspect of it today. So Petra, thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward very much to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you, Jen. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak here. I think it's so important, the work that you are doing. Yeah, so I interpreted the brief in the way that I'm going to speak about international legal aspects, but also a little bit about the UK context and especially how NDCs are being seen as legally binding or not. And I will say a few words about air pollution as the common cause of many health issues, but also climate change. Now, we've already heard about the NDCs, and indeed, this is the core focus of the Paris Agreement. This is really the point upon which the entire success of the Paris Agreement hinges. It is these NDCs that each party has to submit every 5 years. And these NDCs will then form the basis of the global stocktake. The first global stocktake will take place in 2023. And this is really something that we should have our attention on after the COP26 to see what's happening in the global stocktake. Now, everything that is in the NDC is legally binding. The NDCs are legally binding as an instrument in international law. They are unilateral declarations, and they're also binding in national and domestic legal orders. And this has been defined so by the UK Supreme Court in the Heathrow third runway decision, in fact, where the court said that the mitigation obligation relates to the state implementing and achieving the NDC. Now, I've shaped these in different sizes because NDCs are self-determined, and this is what the Paris Agreement wants, but it's also a disadvantage in the sense that every state can determine how ambitious it is and how much it tends to achieve. Some have very clear targets, economy-wide, absolute quantified emission reduction targets, and other states haven't. And this is it's a compromise in the Paris Agreement, as we all know. Now, the second part of this NDC synthesis report that the Secretariat had to make as a legal obligation, again, available to parties ahead of COP26, is now based on the information from 164 latest NDCs, and it covers almost the entire global carbon budget, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of information in this report concerning how much information parties have provided, how many more parties are including health aspects, for example, mitigation co-benefits. But in terms of the absolute figures, and I'm very aware that I've got only a few minutes here, what we can see is that in 2025, emissions will be 58.6% higher than in 1990 and 15.8% higher than in 2010. And in 2030, emissions will be 59.3% higher than in 1990 and 16.3% higher than in 2010. Now, how is that then consistent with the most ambitious goal of the Paris Agreement and, of course, the 1.5 degrees Celsius or the special report of the IPCC? Now, according to the IPCC 1.5 report, to be consistent with global emission pathways with no or limited overshoot of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, emissions need to decline by about 45% from the 2010 levels by 2030. And they would also need to decline by 25% if we were achieving the higher temperature range that the Paris Agreement sets forth. Now, the conclusion then, of course, of the report is that there's an urgent need for either a significant increase in the level of ambition of NDCs between now and 2030. So every 5 years, there needs to be the next and more ambitious NDC. So there is a chance to be more ambitious. or there must be a significant overachievement of the latest NDCs or a combination of both. Now, so far, we don't see the long-term plans that would produce the effects of the NDC. So I think this last alternative of having a significant overachievement of the latest NDCs is very unlikely. Now, this is just a graphical illustration of what we've just discussed. Now, you can see the range between in this graph, and this is something I will come to now. So what we've seen in the latest NDC submissions, that more and more parties rely upon conditional and unconditional elements. They will implement unconditional elements, but also in addition to that, conditional elements. And these conditional elements are made dependent on financial resources, capacity building, support, but also very crucially on Article 6 Paris Agreement, and that the market mechanisms or the cooperative approaches that this article envisages now finally become operational. So this is a real crunching issue of the upcoming negotiations. As you know, the Paris Agreement is a framework agreement that had to be operationalized in the so-called Paris Agreement rulebook, and that is the Katowice climate package that was adopted in 2018 in Katowice COP24. Now, no agreement was found on the mechanism that Article 6 envisages, and there are three different approaches. The first two, 6.2 and 6.4, are both market-based approaches, and Article 6.8 introduces something that's completely new, non-market-based approaches. Now, for many states now, the implementation of their higher ambition targets depends on the fact that these mechanisms now will become available to them. And this presupposes that parties can agree on the Paris Agreement or Article 6 rulebook. Yeah, we've got the Paris Agreement rulebook, but not the rulebook on Article 6. So there are around this provision, there are several international law crunch issues, so to speak, and this is a very political discussion. So there really needs to be now the political will to overcome some of these obstacles in the negotiations. Just mentioning a few here. So the one is the share of proceeds. So how much will these cooperative approaches contribute to the adaptation fund? The other question is surrounding the transition of the clean development mechanism, which is the Kyoto market mechanism. How will that be transferred into the Article 6.4, the sustainable mechanism? And a third issue relates to environmental integrity and avoiding double counting, because at the moment when we have a transfer from one country to another of certain internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, there's always the risk that both countries will claim these outcomes. So how can this be developed in a way that this situation is avoided, so that we are not witnessing a net increase in mitigation outcomes? So these are the issues surrounding Article 6. So this will be a real legal issue that needs to be resolved now in Glasgow. Now, very briefly, the UK also has some aspects in the NDC on air pollution. We've seen, I think, so much about your work in this respect already. So I think much of what I've got on this slide will already be, or you will be aware of all of this. So I will make this really short. I think what is missing here is a concreteness in terms of policies and targets that are enshrined in the NDC, which will impair accountability in the long term. There are, as we know, policy synergies from avoiding air pollution and at the same time protecting or pursuing climate action, protecting the climate. Now, for the first time in the UK, there has been one case where air pollution has been recognized as a material cause of death. As you know, climate litigation is a big driver of change in this field. And of course, around this issue of at least acknowledging that air pollution is causing climate change, but also can be a cause of death, has implications for climate action, climate protection, at least indirectly. But then if we look at the wider picture into other countries, we know that, the clean cooking is a big issue there. And the IEA Net Zero report has summarized that using solid biomass in traditional cooking methods is not only unsustainable, it is also linked to 2.5 million premature deaths in 1 year alone. So again, something that the energy transition needs to address. I also had a quick look, but I know the next speaker will cover the economic aspects more, and it's his expertise, so I'm not going to interfere with that, but just to reiterate that from this perspective, again, if we compare the risk of not acting in a timely fashion, we will see a sharp increase in physical risk from climate change. And we also then see an accelerated risk and cost in the transition. So the short-term cost in the transition that we witness now will fade or pale in comparison to the costs of unfettered climate change in the medium to long term. So ideally, what we would see in line with the 1.5 degree IPCC report, but what we are not seeing in line with the outcome of the NDC synthesis report would be an orderly transition with limited physical risk, where we look into the 1.5 degrees Celsius target instead of the hothouse, which is a temperature scenario where we are roughly heading at the moment of 2.7 degrees Celsius or even higher. So, I mean, you probably all have seen the IPCC Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th assessment report, where under all 5 emission pathways, we would already in 2040 achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the question is then, can we maintain that temperature, or will temperatures rise even further after that? So I think all of these are enough reasons to raise emission levels and to cut emissions more drastically than we see. So I will leave it here, and thank you again very much.
Thank you so much, Petra. I wonder if I could really briefly, before we go to Paul, ask you to give just because some of the concepts, I find them easier with an example, like using countries. Where might a country double count in terms of Article 6? Like, what would that look like?
Yes, so for example, if we've got a country that has a certain market-based approach, a cooperative approach under Article 6.2, that can then, let's say it's investing into green energy. It produces certain internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, and these can then be sold to another country. Another country can purchase it to meet its own NDC. There's then a wider issue of whether it can also purchase these emission reduction units outside its NDC, or if you can sell something that is not covered by your own NDC. So that is a side problem. But the original problem is country A produces an ITMO, internationally transferable mitigation outcome, and another country acquires it. In an ideal scenario, then, country A must increase its emission because it loses these ITMOs, and country B has acquired the ITMO and has therefore a lower emission account.
So one example I heard was that Brazil could protect rainforest and then sell those credits to Canada, for example. And then you wouldn't want both of them. Then it might mean either that Brazil gets to pollute more, but you also wouldn't want both of those countries to say, well, we both reduced, because it's technically been transferred, even though it's a strange sort of esoteric trading. Is that true?
Absolutely. You need to make, in that sense, a corresponding adjustment. So as long as you've produced a real mitigation outcome, a real reduction, let's say, in greenhouse gas emissions, it works. You can then say that, well, I've produced this, but another country will account for it. So for that country that acquires your minus emissions will go down, but your own emissions will go up because you have sold an emission reduction. And of course, as you can imagine, if you haven't produced a net emission, but you still claim you have done that, and you sell it to another country, this is where the trouble starts. You can make so many corresponding adjustments. If you haven't produced a real emission reduction in the first place, environmental integrity is completely lost. And I mean, that is the clearest cut no-go area, so to speak. But there are other examples where countries can or could find loopholes and, in fact, offset emissions to a point that we see in factual increase. Now, I can give you one example, and that is if a country has a single year target and not a trajectory of interim targets, it could, in theory, produce greenhouse gas emissions at a very high level, increasing trajectory, and then purchase in the last year, before it has to account for its target year, greenhouse gas emission reductions from other countries. And then the target year would come to the conclusion that that country has in fact met the target, but in fact it hasn't, because it has produced even more net emissions. It has only purchased enough negative emissions or credits at one point, so that it can then say, well, we have met in this last final year our target. And so there is now the discussion, I think that's halfway there, that parties that want to participate in this form of carbon market and tradings of ITMOs, that they will have to agree to a trajectory of targets, so that there are interim targets that can then demonstrate that there has been a real achievement.
Wow. Thank you. It's very complex stuff.
Yeah, there's then a further discussion of whether you can produce in ITMO even outside an area or sector that you have covered, that you haven't even covered in your NDC. So let's assume you have got the cement sector that is not covered by your NDC. Can you then produce an emission reduction that you can trade in the similar way, even though it will not be flagged up in your NDC? And some parties say, well, because it's not covered in my NDC, I'm not responsible for demonstrating any corresponding adjustment because I haven't covered it. But that again would go against the idea of having most comprehensive NDCs, all sectors covered, everything included. We really say here, a lot of negotiation, and there needs to be some political will to overcome these hurdles, hopefully this year, because overall ambition depends on these mechanisms.
Thanks so much, Petra. That's certainly stuff that I've tried to grapple with after multiple attempts and haven't quite managed to yet, so that's hugely helpful. I was going to ask for the health mentions that we've tracked in NDCs. So if a country commits to develop a health adaptation plan, or if a country commits to monitor the health impacts of air pollution, and doesn't do that by the timeline that it's set in its NDC, what in practice could a citizen of that country or an organization in that country do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That would depend on the legal framework in every country. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons why in some NDCs we will find a rather prosaic language. It's something that the country intends to pursue, and then you can always demonstrate that you had the intention or you did pursue, but you didn't quite meet it. So we call these like a new set of outcome duties, where we have certain outcomes, but it's not quite clear when they will be achieved. Can they be adjusted? I mean, even in the UK, theoretically, we could circumvent any recommendation of the Climate Change Commission and adjust the target. I don't think it's very likely that this will happen, but legally it is probably possible to say, well, we haven't quite met the 68%, let's adjust it. In theory, that would be possible. But the Supreme Court has said that in the decision on the Heathrow third runway, that there is an obligation to implement the NDC that is applicable to a state. So you can interpret this paragraph in the decision as the Supreme Court saying that the NDC is seen as being binding on the UK. So here, if we had a certain policy or a certain action that had to be taken and you can demonstrate it's not being taken, that could then lead to judicial review.
Thank you very much. So we're going to turn it over to Paul to give us a take on economics.
Paul is one of the members of Working Group 4 for the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. He's going to present some Lancet Countdown today and some policy action points for each of those sets of data. Thank you ever so much, Paul, for making time for this today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I will present a brief summary of the indicators we have in the 2020 report of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. I would like to have presented the 2021 report results, but that's not yet published, and it wouldn't go down too well if I presented those first before it was. So the Economics and Finance section of the Lancet Countdown Global Report has 9 indicators tracking the link between the economic aspects of the connection between health and climate change. So there are 2 key groups. The first is the health and economic costs of climate change and the benefits from tackling climate change. And the second group is the economics of the transition to zero carbon economies. So I'll give a brief overview of the key issues, and I'm happy to take questions on any of the detail afterwards. So the first indicator is the value of economic losses due to climate-related extreme events. So we found that in 2019, global losses due to these extreme events, these would be things like hurricanes, high winds, floods, extreme heat events, were worth $132 billion. These were concentrated mainly in high-income countries, mainly because these are where generally high dollar value assets are based and in more densely packed situations. But when we compared these losses against GDP in the 4 different World Bank income groups, this being high income, middle high, low middle, and low income, the losses in the low income countries were around 5 times greater compared to their GDP compared to high income countries. Another big issue here is which losses are insured and which aren't insured. So at least 2/3 of the losses in high income countries were insured, so could be replaced without out-of-pocket expenses from those who incurred the losses. Whereas in low income countries, less than 5% of the losses were insured. So to replace that infrastructure, those assets, the owners would have to pay themselves to replace it or simply not replace it at all. The second indicator is the costs of heat-related mortality. So this is the economic value of lives lost due to deaths caused by heat stress. This was calculated to be equivalent to around 0.23% of global world product. That's the collection of all international gross domestic products, or GDP, in 2000. This grew to about 0.37% in 2018, indicating an increased incidence of death due to heat stress. We also looked at this in relation to the average income of people in different regions. So surprisingly, perhaps the worst affected area was Europe, and the economic value of the lives lost in Europe in 2018 were equivalent to 1.2% of gross national income in Europe. And that was the equivalent of the income of 11 million European people. And on the right here, we can see the breakdown by different global regions, with Europe on the top. And with the very bottom, I think, is Africa. So the third indicator was the loss of earnings from heat-related reduction in labour capacity. So essentially lost earnings from simply being unable to work, from it simply being too hot. In 2015, the earnings lost were equivalent to nearly 6% of GDP in lower middle income countries, particularly predominant in agriculture. So this is amongst the lowest paid sector, but obviously being outside, you're more exposed to heat, and you have no access to air conditioning, for example. And there were much lower losses, surprisingly perhaps, in other countries so far, but that will likely change. The fourth indicator looked at the costs of health impacts of air pollution. So the monetized impact of the impact on human health due to respiratory illnesses or heart conditions due to particulate matter pollution, so specifically PM2.5, due only to anthropogenic, so human-induced actions, such as through fossil fuel combustion, through heating, or through driving cars. We focus only here on Europe due to issues of comparable data, but we will have a global coverage in the 2021 report. And the overarching outcome was that air pollution health impacts and the associated monetized costs in Europe have decreased between 2015 and 2018. But even in 2018, the average years of life lost, which is a typical metric to measure the impact on life from different environmental consequences, was about 5.7 months per person on average in Europe. But according to the graph on the right, you can see that did vary quite a lot. So the y-axis on the right and the grey dots indicate variation across Europe. I think the highest was just above 9 months in Poland in 2018 on average per person. And this was worth an economic value of $116 billion per year across Europe. So quite substantial. So the second group looked at the economics of the transition to zero carbon economies. The first indicator in this group looks at investment in new coal capacity, so coal being the most carbon intensive way of producing electricity. And investment across the world has been declining since 2011, and it decreased between 6% between 2018 and 2019. And there's been a much bigger decrease between 2019 and 2020, as you'll see in the 2021 edition of the Lancet Countdown. But despite this, overall capacity of coal generation across the world has been increasing, mainly because there have been fewer and fewer retirements of old capacity, meaning the additions are simply adding up and not decreasing in the same way. The second indicator looks at investments in different aspects of the wider energy system. So the division of investment between different aspects. So the chart on the right gives you fossil fuels, the grey component. The dark green aspect is renewables. Hydropower is the small blue component. Electricity networks and energy storage through batteries, particularly, is the light green component. And energy efficiency is the top purple bar as well. So the division between these remain roughly stable between 2016 and 2019, but this does hide an aspect in renewables particularly, with costs of particularly solar and onshore wind, but also offshore wind, decreasing rapidly even just across these 4 to 5 years, meaning the capacity of these technologies has been rapidly increasing, but the investment cost per unit has decreased, meaning that the overall investment level globally has remained roughly stable. But compared to where this needs to be, we're quite far behind. So by 2030, total investment in the global energy system needs to approximately double from around 2 trillion per year to over 4 trillion per year. And more than 50% of that needs to be invested in renewables and energy efficiency. So we're quite a long way from where that needs to be, only a decade out. The third indicator looks at employment in renewables and fossil fuel extraction. So in renewables, this looks at direct employment in the renewable sector, so manufacturing and installation and operation, but also the indirect downstream supply chain employment effects, whereas the fossil fuel, oil, coal and gas extraction looks only at those involved in the extraction of these fuels. So in 2019, around 11.5 million people were employed in the renewables direct and indirect supply chain around the world. But this was a bit less than those employed in the direct extraction of fossil fuels at about 12.7 million people. But the trends over time are positive. So when we started the countdown in 2017, the disparity was much higher. And I won't say exactly what will be published in the 2021 report, but it's even more positive. So the fourth indicator in this category is funds divested from fossil fuels. And the chart on the right shows the trend over time from 2013 to 2019. The red line is the global total, and the blue line is the total for healthcare institutions. So by 2019, funds and assets worth over $11.5 trillion globally had committed to divesting from fossil fuels, from essentially zero in 2013. And around $42 billion of this were healthcare institutions, although that's remained fairly static since 2017. So this one is perhaps the most complicated. This is the net value of fossil fuel subsidies and carbon prices. So carbon pricing being the economist's favorite tool for trying to reduce pollution that don't experience a price. So you put a price on the carbon, it makes it more expensive to emit. You incentivize people to move away from emitting so much of it. Fossil fuel subsidies can come in a variety of ways, and these can be either on the production of fossil fuels. So for example, tax breaks on North Sea oil extraction or gas extraction for wherever it might be, or on the consumption of fossil fuels. So this could be, for example, regulated electricity prices or subsidies on gasoline or diesel, which are pretty prevalent across the world. And so the fossil fuel subsidies acts in the opposite direction. It increases the incentive to consume fossil fuels, whereas carbon prices acts on the carbon emitted from fossil fuels and therefore it tries to incentivize less consumption of it. The panels here are three. So the first on the left, panel A, is the net carbon price. So what's the overall carbon price when you net off fossil fuel subsidies from carbon pricing? And I'm afraid to say overall the impact is essentially negative. So fossil fuel subsidies are greater than carbon pricing, meaning that the overall incentive is to increase the consumption of fossil fuels. The second panel B in the middle looks at the net revenues. So this is the revenue to governments from the imposition of carbon pricing. The most probably well-known example globally is the European emissions trading system, which places a price on carbon emitted from the power sector and certain industrial sector emissions in Europe. and all those revenues from auctioning permits or from carbon taxes go to government in Europe. This is then netted off from the value of lost revenue to governments from subsidizing fossil fuels. And again, these are negative. So the government is essentially paying society to consume fossil fuels. And the third one, panel C, is panel B, so the total net revenue for governments as a share of total healthcare expenditure across the world. And again, that's negative. So yeah, as I said, the overarching takeaway message from that is the fossil fuel subsidies globally are much greater than carbon pricing. And so the overarching net incentive is to continue increasing the consumption of fossil fuels and therefore the carbon they emit. That's the end of my summary, but I'm happy to take any questions on any aspect of this or its implications. Thank you.
No problem at all. That was wonderful. If somewhat concerning, your fine point on fossil fuel subsidies being higher than carbon pricing is very clear and very distressing. Does anybody have questions for Paul or for Petra?
Paul, it sounds like there have been pretty significant advances in the methodology for this, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you might hope to achieve in future Lancet Countdown reports, not in terms of giving away any 2021 data, but if there are other things that you would like to be able to measure in 2022 and beyond?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one issue we've had for a while on this aspect of the countdown is it is in sometimes a bit removed from the health aspects particularly, and in some cases simply putting an economic value on health impacts doesn't necessarily give an extra strength of the message that health impact is kind of strength enough. But broadly speaking, I think these sorts of numbers help to speak particularly to policymakers, and often policymakers in finance ministries who often only see things in terms of a fairly straightforward cost-benefit analysis. I think in terms of what I'd like to be able to measure more, I think there's quite a few. I think probably things like the health impacts and then the economic value of those health impacts of things like indoor air pollution, particularly in lower income countries where the issue is substantially more prevalent and problematic than it is in higher income countries. I think also perhaps looking at the economic losses, I think I'd like to be able to specifically look at the value of losses of fairly critical infrastructure that might be particularly crucial for healthcare. So for example, it could be sanitary infrastructure that gets lost in climate-related extreme events, or it could be directly things like hospitals. That would maybe strike a bit more of a refined message for the direct impact of climate change consequences on healthcare systems. Yeah, I mean, it could be quite extensive, but I think being quite selective is useful to not overpower the direct health message with simply trying to convert everything into an economic message, because many times it's simply not appropriate or the most powerful way of getting action to happen.
Thanks so much. Both Paul and Petra, if you were going to summarize what you think needs to happen in both your areas to protect health in one or two sentences, what would that be?
That's a really good question. I think because the NDCs are at the core of the Paris Agreement and act on both levels, the national level and the international level, if you want to combine climate action with health action, you need to write it as a clear target into the NDC.
Thank you. That's great and really speaks to the work that Jess has been doing around investigating the countries that have done that. Paul, can I flip it back to you?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, thinking about the policy to drive the transition, I think it's hard to separate the health impact simply from the wider transition issue. I think the one thing I would try and change is decision-making processes in governments. They're often simply based on a fairly outdated and quite inappropriate way of assessing the economic values of costs and benefits of taking action. And in almost, well, I wouldn't say necessarily every case, but in many, many cases, taking action often generates a great deal more benefit at a vastly lower cost over time than is often estimated. And because that sort of the dynamics of how innovation happens, of how transition happens, aren't very well accounted for in the kind of fairly prescriptive government decision-making processes, the benefits of transition on health particularly, but in many other ways, simply aren't accounted for. And so action is generally stymied and held up by inappropriate ways of looking about the problem itself.
Thank you very much. So include health in the NDCs and find new ways to value taking action that actually represents the benefits we're going to get from it, is what I summarized those last 2 points as. Again, thank you so much, Petra and Paul, for joining us this week. I have learned a lot, and your clarity in walking us through this is so appreciated.